Yields back. Chair recognizes himself. Madam Chair, why are you harassing Twitter?
Congressman, thanks for the question. As you might know, the FTC's work on Twitter goes back a decade. Back in 2009.
I'm not talking about a decade. I'm talking about now. 12 demand letters in 10 weeks, over 350 separate requests you've demanded of Twitter. Why are you harassing them?
Twitter has a history of lax security and privacy policies.
You've asked for every single communication relating to Elon Musk, not communications that he just sent to someone or some communications he received, but any time he's mentioned. That actually seems more than harassment. That seems like almost an obsession. Why such an intense focus?
So, Congressman, again, it was found that Twitter's lax privacy policies allowed unauthorized users to co-opt Twitter accounts, including that of Fox News. Subsequently, Twitter voluntarily entered into a consent order with the FTC.
Here's what you wrote in December. Madam Chair, here's what you wrote in December. Identify all journalists and other members of the media to whom Twitter has granted access since Musk bought the company. You want to know the name of every journalist a private company has talked to? Think that's consistent with the First Amendment?
Congressman, as a former journalist, I take extremely seriously the valuable work that they do and understand that there can be instances in which government action is unjustifiably
particularly, Madam Chair, if I could just interject, particularly in the context here. I mean, it's bad enough if you got government asking a private company about who are the journalists you're talking to, you name 4 of them and say, we want the other names of any journalists you may in fact be communicating with. That's bad enough. And I think a threat to the First Amendment, freedom of the press. But in the context of giving us information about how government had suppressed speech on these platforms, that's the context you're asking for. I think that's particularly troubling, don't you?
Congressman, the consent decree that we have prohibits Twitter from sharing personal information with third parties. When we read in the papers, like everybody else, that Twitter may have granted access to third parties, that's what our teams were seeking information about. Again, this is a company whose history with the FTC goes back a decade.
We got limited time. Madam Chair, who is David Roque?
Could you repeat that, Congressman?
David Roque, R-O-Q-U-E. Who is David Roque?
I'm not familiar with that.
You deposed him last month, June 21st, 2023. David Roque is the independent partner for Ernst & Young's independent assessment of Twitter's program. That's part of this consent decree. Do you know what Mr. Roque said in that deposition?
I'm not aware.
Okay, let me read it for you then, because I think it's pretty important. Mr. Roque testified, again, one of your lawyers, you deposed him, testified that FTC's conduct made him feel as if the FTC was trying to influence the outcome of the engagement before it had started. He said, in some of the discussions that we were having with the Federal Trade Commission, expectations were being conveyed about what those results should be before we had even begun any procedures. So they're the independent assessor in this consent decree the FTC has with Twitter, and you're telling the guy who is the person. He's the guy. He's Joe the accountant who's going to get this information. You're telling him, you're putting your finger on the scale, telling him what you want the outcome to be, and he's supposed to be the independent fact finder. Why are you doing that?
Congressman, I'm not familiar with those.
Because it was just filed today, but we are. This is filed in court today, and this is your deposition.
I'm happy to take a closer look at it and be back in touch. I will say as a general matter, we want to make sure that the assessors and auditors that are responsible for overseeing compliance are doing their job.
You say Mr. Roque's line, what he testified here, what's been filed in court today, that there were suggestions of what they would expect the outcome to be, they being the FTC, there were suggestions of what they wanted him to go find in his independent assessment of the consent decree agreement between the FTC and Twitter.
Again, I'm happy to take a close look and we can be back in touch with you about that allegation, but our staff are consummate professionals. When they conduct these investigations, they're focused on determining whether there was a violation.
Is your attack on Twitter, harassment on Twitter, is that based on the fact that all kinds of Democrats have asked you to do this and frankly some things that you've written about dealing with, quote, disinformation? Does that have anything to do with it, Ms. Khan?
Congressman, we make only independent determinations about whether there were law violations.
The statement from Chairman Nadler, the statements from the letter, the press release and the letter from 7 Democrat senators that had no impact on it, that's not why you're doing it?
Absolutely not. We look very closely at the specific matter at hand. Again,
12
Twitter
demand
is-
letters in 10 weeks telling the independent assessor, hey, put your finger on the scale. This is the results we want. That's not harassment, and it had nothing to do with the fact that every Democrat in this town seemed to be telling you to go after Twitter.
Our focus is on protecting people's privacy and security. Twitter has sensitive data on 150 million Americans, including private messages. We need to make sure, especially given its history going all the way back to 2010, we're doing everything to make sure Twitter is complying with the order.
That's fine. Don't put your finger on the scale, and don't attack the First Amendment and the rights of journalists. Thank the gentleman for yielding. Ms. Khan, earlier, and I believe the gentleman from Arizona brought this up, you said people's privacy is paramount. I couldn't agree more. And as we talked earlier, I do think there's bipartisan support to deal with that, this sweeping up of data that happens, and scarier yet is FBI purchasing that data. So that is of paramount importance. But I would say the First Amendment's of paramount importance too. Would you agree?
Absolutely.
And then the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, asked you, what's disinformation? And you said you don't really have an opinion on that. Was that a fair assessment of your answer?
As part of our job at the FTC, we're focused on deception and fraud and that sort of thing.
Well, you wrote a couple years ago in a Law Review article, digital businesses such as Twitter disserve their users by facilitating the spread of disinformation. What were you talking about there then? What's disinformation?
I'm happy to take a closer look at the material you're mentioning, but as part of our work at the FTC, we've seen how fraud and scams can sometimes proliferate on these social media websites. We've launched an inquiry to try to understand, why are some of these crypto scams really proliferating on these sites, and what can we be doing?
These are the first two sentences in the introduction of the piece you wrote, again, just a couple years ago. Digital businesses such as Twitter disserve their users by facilitating the spread of disinformation. Who decides what's disinformation?
From the FTC's perspective, it's deception and fraud.
No, that's fine. You can keep using synonyms, but I want to know who decides that it's deception, who decides that it's fraud, who decides that it's disinformation. In this case, you're talking about social media companies and what gets posted on their platform. Who decides what's disinformation, what isn't?
So, Congressman, again, at the FTC, we're focused on fraud and deception. There is a legal standard about what constitutes fraud. Again, this is about...
But you didn't say fraud or deception, you said disinformation. And my concern is, again, and it's probably the third time I've talked about this, but the sustained attack on Twitter when the ownership there changed and the platform was committed to not taking down speech, not taking down posts, allowing the sharing of information, and not censoring information. And we just had a major decision last week from a court in Louisiana, a federal court in Louisiana, where they said the government was in fact pressuring big tech companies to censor, and big tech companies were willing to go along with it. Now we have a change there, and you're going after the one company that's changed how they're doing things. That's what concerns me, particularly in light of the fact that you just wrote about this a few years ago, saying this is what goes on.
Congressman, I'm glad to have the opportunity to clarify some issues here. So we at the FTC have no view on who should or should not own a company. All we care about is that the company is following the law. That's really what our focus is.
We've covered that ground. I want to know about disinformation and who decides what's disinformation. You think the government should decide that?
Congressman, the way I see it is concentrations of economic power, including over speech platforms and communications platform, that it's that concentrated power and the ability to pick who gets heard, who doesn't get heard, to make these types of decisions. That, I think, is concerning to all of us, and the FTC's job is to be promoting...
You know what kind of speech was getting censored? Do you know what the court said last week? Have you read the opinion, by the way?
I have not. It did not concern the FTC.
You know what kind of speech was getting censored? You know what the court said? Conservative speech. Conservative speech was the suppression was virtually all conservative. This is not Jim Jordan talking about. This is not Republicans on the Judiciary Committee talking. This is the federal judge who had the facts, 86 pages of facts, and put the facts and the law together in this opinion, strong opinion, which said it was a conservative speech that was getting censored and labeled as disinformation.
So, Congressman, I fully understand why, given the extreme concentration of power over some of these speech platforms, why people would be afraid and worried about censorship. I couldn't agree more that when you have a handful of people making decisions about what gets seen, what doesn't get seen, who gets heard.
And you think the remedy to that is for government to decide what's disinformation and what's not?
Congressman, at the FTC, our job is to promote competition. More competition means more people making these decisions, and I think that can alleviate some of the concerns about censorship that you're sharing.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida is recognized.
How timely. You are a brilliant woman with a tremendous ability to impact how consumers are going to interface with the digital world for a long time to come. And I want to get to those areas of agreement, but there is some ugliness we got to deal with. Now, you guys putting in the names of reporters in a correspondence to Twitter was solely predicated based on anonymous news sources, right?
It was based on reporting that
Right, and we would agree that anonymous reporting is not a sufficient predicate to target, to send letters about journalists who are your critics, right?
Congressman, yeah, I mean, the goal was third parties, but this is good feedback for us. We want to make sure we're not in any way suggesting that we're interested in, affecting journalists' work. It's really about privacy and security. So I
appreciate your acknowledgement that that is not the way we ought to do things. As someone who has seen ugly government action emerge out of anonymous reporting, perhaps I'm a little sensitive to that, but I'm glad that you've made that acknowledgement. Let's get on to the important work that you are doing. Millions of Americans have Ring doorbell cameras. And your agency recently put out a correspondence saying, quote, during a 3-month period in 2017, a Ring employee viewed thousands of videos of female users in their bedrooms and bathrooms, including videos of Ring's own employees. There was also at Ring, according to the FTC, an unauthorized tunnel that allowed a Ukraine-based contractor to access consumer videos. An incident where a Ring employee gave information about a customer's to their ex-husband was also something that you uncovered. You also state that bad actors at Ring took advantage of the camera's two-way communication functionality to harass and threaten people who used Ring cameras. There was a case where an 87-year-old woman at an assisted living facility was sexually propositioned through Ring's two-way features. Kids were subject to racial slurs. A hacker got in and threatened a family with physical harm if they did not pay a Bitcoin ransom. And one hacker even communicated through the two-way feature to a customer that they had already killed the customer's mother and, quote, tonight you die. What is going on at Ring?
So as you noted, we recently took enforcement action precisely because of these very serious lapses in data privacy, which endangered Americans in their day-to-day lives. Overall, looking at some of these surveillance devices and how they can be misused and abused is a top area of focus for us because people's privacy is paramount.
Yeah, I thought that when people got Ring, it was to enhance their personal security, not to have their 87-year-old relative in an ALF sexually propositioned, their children to be slurred at, and then to be told that they were going to be killed if they didn't pay Bitcoin ransom. So thank you for that effort. Let's go to another evil company, Kochava. Kochava is one of these data brokers that you're going after, right?
That's right.
And the American people should know that Kochava geolocates where people go to church, and then they sell that data to commercial enterprises, right?
That's right.
That's real creepy, isn't it?
I believe most people would have that reaction, yes.
I got onto the FBI director yesterday for their creepy FISA activity, and now we have Kochava literally selling to people, oh, well, this is a Baptist, this is a Methodist, this is someone who goes to temple. Are you going to get these people and stop them?
So we have a pending lawsuit. We filed it last year. The court dismissed it. They gave us the opportunity to refile. We just refiled an amended complaint. And we think it's urgent to act here because, the types of stigmatization and harms that can stem from being able to track and sell people's sensitive geolocation information is just critical for us to be addressing.
We didn't like it when the FBI was wanting to infiltrate the Catholic churches, and I don't know that I want the data brokers to do the same. And by the way, we've even seen how the FBI is using the data brokers to do an end run around the Fourth Amendment. So I really want to encourage your work in this space, and I hope that your litigation against Kochava is something that creates precedent. And you know what? There's been criticism of some of your losses in court, but we as sophisticated lawyers know sometimes that a motion to dismiss an initial complaint can create a pathway to an amended complaint to achieve relief. And so if the laws are insufficient to stop data brokers from selling information about where my constituents worship, and if the laws are insufficient to stop Ring from these activities, I really hope you'll work with us to change those laws. And all of Mr. Buck's points are really central to this, because if Congress is bought off, if people are just coming here to beat you up over what email account you use or what trip you've been on to Europe, I think it misses these things that are far more central to the life that our constituents lead. Thank you for your work.
Congressman, when I had the honor to work for this committee, I complied with all of the document requests that the HR folks requested, including documentation about the fact
When I checked your registration status this morning, I learned that you are not in good standing with the New York Bar. Your license is listed as delinquent, which means you have failed to file your biennial registrations, and it means that you have not been paying your bar dues, completing your continuing legal education, and maintaining your law license.
The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Wyoming.
Like other federal agencies, the FTC has a designated agency ethics official known as DAO. On April 18, 2023, you testified before a subcommittee of the House Energy and Commerce Committee. At the hearing, Chair Rogers asked you, quote, "Are there any instances where you have not followed the DAO's advice?" End quote. You responded no, and you followed up by saying that you, quote, "have consulted with the DAO and taken actions that are consistent with the legal statements that DAO has made," end quote. On June 16, 2023, a Bloomberg journalist published a leaked memoranda written by the FTC's DAO analyzing Chair Khan's ability to sit as a judge in the FTC's review of Meta's acquisition of a company called Within. According to the ethics memoranda, the DAO, quote, recommended you recuse to avoid an appearance of partiality concern pursuant to federal ethics regulations. Do you believe that you were completely honest and forthcoming with Congress when you asked if there were, quote, any instances where you had not followed the DAO's advice, and you answered no? Yes or no?
Yes, Congresswoman.
Okay. In the letter that you sent to this committee yesterday evening, you claim that you received only oral advice from the DAO, but never saw the leaked memo until after you decided not to recuse yourself. First, it is unbelievable to me that you would not ask for written ethics advice on this particular topic. You admit that you have written ethics advice on other topics, but on this topic you claim you did not see the written memo. Instead, you want us to believe that you only received oral advice and not specific oral advice, but only general advice on, quote, understanding the legal framework, end quote. Did DAO give you advice that is different than what was written in the memoranda?
Thanks for the question, Congresswoman. So my work before I joined the commission was focused on assessing the power of large technology.
I need you to answer the question that I asked. The question that I asked was, did you receive different oral advice than what was written in the memoranda from DAO? Very simple question.
So I consulted with the ethics official. The ethics official, as was noted in the memo that you cited, although I did not receive that memo, noted that the ultimate framework for instances in which somebody has no financial conflicts of interest.
Did she give you different oral advice than what was in the written memoranda?
The legal framework
yes or no?
is for the employee to themselves determine whether they should or should not recuse.
Did she give you different advice than what was orally than was in the written memoranda? Yes or no?
Congressman, as was noted in the written memoranda, there was no ethics violation created by my participating in the matter.
But you didn't follow the DAO's advice, did you? You could have recused at any time, couldn't you?
I followed the determination that there was no ethics violation.
You could have recused at any time, couldn't you?
There was no violation under the ethics laws because I have not a penny in financial stock, not a penny in financial interest.
The DAO gave you the advice to recuse and you did not do so, correct?
Congresswoman, as was noted in the memo, as I noted in the letter.
I'm going to move on since you're not willing to answer my question. I read your 4-page letter, which was nothing more than an affront to your obligations of honesty, integrity, and candor before this tribunal that is owed by every public servant. And I would reference Part 2635 of the Code of Federal Regulations, which describes your ethics standards. I want to note that the ethics standards are actually higher than one owed by lawyers, which brings me to my next point. Do you expect lawyers at the FTC to follow federal ethics rules?
Of course, everybody at the Federal Trade
Do you
Commission.
expect lawyers at the FTC to be an active member in good standing of a bar of a U.S. state?
If they're practicing as a lawyer, they need to be in good standing with the
Okay.
relevant bar rules.
I understand that you were admitted to the New York Bar on July 16, 2020, but in 2019 and 2020, according to your Senate questionnaire, you held yourself out as counsel for the Democrats on this very committee. You used this title, but you were not licensed to practice law. Counsel is a term reserved for lawyers, licensed lawyers. And in Wyoming, a person who in any manner holds themselves as competent to practice law without a license to do so is guilty of unauthorized practice of law. I believe the law in the District of Columbia where you held yourself out is similar. Do you believe it is appropriate for non-lawyers to claim the title of counsel?
Congressman, when I had the honor to work for this committee, I complied with all of the document requests that the HR folks requested, including documentation about the fact
When
that
I checked your registration status this morning, I learned that you are not in good standing with the New York Bar. Your license is listed as delinquent, which means you have failed to file your biennial registrations, and it means that you have not been paying your bar dues, completing your continuing legal education, and maintaining your law license. I believe it's shown on the screen. It also means you're subject to referral for disciplinary action. I find this situation to be stunning and a reflection on your ethics. With that, I yield.